Well, welcome to the last session of TechEd, 2010. I don't want to predetermine the end of the world. My name's Troy Kirkland. I work for the Premier Field Engineering team, and part of my role is to, for the last 3 years, support SharePoint in New Zealand. So we do two things. Did anyone come to session this morning? Cool. Same lies. Excellent. Okay, so a mix of our work is training people. So we run workshops and we do audits about configuration and design choices that hopefully mean that you have a better SharePoint experience. And about 15 and 20% of that is fixing it. So we get quite a good insight into applied marketing as such. So in this presentation, I'll go through some of the areas that we're currently seeing either a continuing trend in configuration issues, an increasing trend in one particular area in particular. If you're at the previous presentation, I say in 12 months' time that they'll have this issue, so I'm emailing them tonight. And a lot of my own opinion. So there'll be certain areas where I vary dramatically from our corporate guidance, and the reason I do that is because applied marketing leads me to believe that sometimes the settings I'm about to give you might be a little bit better. So the stuff we cover, some of it will seem reasonably far-fetched, remote risk, blah, blah, blah. The reason I'm covering it is because it's better to be prepared. So when I look at SharePoint environments where unexpected things have occurred, it's typically not because it's one thing that happened. It's typically not because it was the obvious thing that happened, but it's the perfect storm of little things that culminated in a reasonably unfortunate event. So what we'll do is we'll go through some of this history in applied configuration as such. So the agenda is fairly loose. We'll go through some of the components and configuration. Some of this might seem like sucking eggs. There are reasons these eggs are to be sucked, so hopefully I'll point those out. Search in particular, there is some interesting knowledge gaps. So I'll highlight why you might want to focus on certain areas. And then performance and troubleshooting together. And if we have time, either get drunk or I'll go through some examples which I'll try and interject into the entire presentation so that we can do both. So the components. So at a high level, SQL Server databases, the SharePoint application, IIS, and the always missing but reasonably important component, the server itself. Typically when I come to an environment where something has gone dramatically wrong, it's because the fourth item was ignored. So we'll go through some guidance for that. Really simple guidance, but if you want to turn a bad experience into a horrible experience, server's the one you want to ignore. All right. So on the database level, and I'll go through and show some of this. It's a level 300 presentation. Some of the demos are a little bit shallow, but what I'm trying to get through is technical depth by implication. So understand your databases. This is quite an interesting area for me because I have a reasonably perverse sense of humour. But it's not uncommon for me to go to site where they've spent a lot of money. And they've spent a lot of money building a platform that they're very proud of that doesn't work. To me, that's probably one of the criteria you want. Is to know thy farm. So it's not uncommon you'll turn up and there's this massive SQL Server with all of this disk and SAN and blah, blah, blah. And they haven't planned what disk is required for which workload. Where you'll see this in most cases is how you view content. To me, a content database needs to be recoverable. It doesn't need to be performant because you're not doing much with content. So content you're basically reading out of the database. It doesn't take long to actually get a record. How did you find that record? You searched for it. Okay, how many items did you have to search to get that? 1 billion, okay. So maybe search is slightly more important than content. So understanding the impact of the search database, I'll show you in Procmon, so we can make it 300. And also the temp database. I love TempDB. There's a really nice SQL white paper on how you should build performant TempDB, but we'll go through that in a little bit more depth. And when we come to databases themselves, there's a couple of options we want to look at. The second one on that list, shrink. Never shrink a SharePoint database unless you really know what you're doing. Never turn on auto shrink. That will cause a reasonably interesting outcome. So when you shrink a database, you're typically doing this as an offline process. You'll take the farm down, you'll push all the white space to the end of it, to the tail, and then you'll shrink. I've seen cases where people have forgotten that the tail is where it'll shrink to. Growth, very common issue. When we ship SharePoint, we have a database creation process that will take the model DB. It'll then create that as a content database, and off you go. Now, out of the box, the default settings for a model DB is 1 meg auto growth unlimited or unrestricted growth, which is fine for a transactional SQL database. When you're injecting a multi-meg document into SharePoint, you're going to get a couple of growth commands. If you're pre-SP2, they're going to be fragmented as well. So it's not uncommon to find a several gigabyte content database in 1 meg fragments. So out of the box, you want to have a look at tuning this auto growth or growth figure. And I'll show you some guidance on that. The other one, and this is kind of an operational impact, is understand your restore mode. Full or simple. Do you need to restore to the last good transaction? Then full is what you want. Do you not need to? Can you go to last night's backup? Then consider simple. It's quite common that we'll see environments where they say, yeah, now we need to get back the last transaction, and it's in simple recovery mode. So unless you're doing one transaction every 1 to 2 days, it's probably not feasible. Okay. Now, one other area that we have some reasonably interesting lack of documentation as well as understanding is the security model. So within SharePoint, you'll have this process or context account, depending on the document you read, that sits there as part of the web application. Now, what that means is that any request made, with one exception, to the database will be made as that account. So if I log into the site as Joe Blogs and say, get me document 1, doc1.doc, the process account connects to SQL, pulls the document back to the application. It's then trimmed, pre-trimmed, to show you the list or the document. So the user never makes a direct connection to that. But the account is given very particular permissions to the database and also in some cases to the registry. So changing and reconfiguring these process accounts has to be done through the application. You can't do these manually. If you see someone go into IIS and change the application pool that the site executes within, or changing the identity of the application pool, fairly much guarantee you very soon something bad will happen. Now, the one exception to this, and the one we don't document, is that when you search in the search database, all content access accounts, so all content process accounts, need rights to that database as well. So if you go through and deploy SharePoint and then harden the database, you may run into that issue if you remove too many accounts. Okay. The other concept that we see a slight gap on is the use of SQL Server aliases. So if you were to deploy SharePoint, we would highly recommend that you alias out your SQL instance. What that means is that you can easily change where your databases reside. Example, and this I can blame me, we have a lab. I deleted SQL Server from the lab. SharePoint was using it. Performance stopped. Not good. So what I did is I took the SQL databases and restored them to another SQL server and just slapped an alias in, and it just opens them up and renders them. A few hits of the hammer for some permissions and you're away and laughing. Now the way that that can be done is because I just put an alias in place. So you either do them as a planned process, call it something useful, or I just called the alias the old SQL Server name and then pointed it to the new instance, and it was away and laughing. So the use of the alias is fairly critical for removing these unfortunate events. Okay, databases in depth, and I'll show you in the next slide in SQL. So the TempDB requires special consideration, especially if you are performing large queries. So if you're a search SharePoint site, TempDB needs a lot of love. So when we look at the TempDB, it's going to have a file group. So the actual database file is a group, and within that group there are multiple files. The more files you have in the file group means that the more CPUs can execute that process. So if I have a 4-core server, I could have 4 files in the file group to give the most performance. So basically removing the bottleneck between 4 CPUs to 1 file and making it 4 to 4. Now the obvious gotcha is that you're now moving that bottleneck to disk. So when you create multiple files in a file group, you need to have performant disk to do that. If you read the SQL Server white paper, you need to spend a lot of money. In practical terms, it's somewhere in the middle there. So for a, and I can say it now, he's not in the room, for a search site that wasn't performant, we basically went to 4 temp.db files, 2 files on 2 RAID 1 sets. You don't want to lose a temp.db file. Server has to be restarted. So for a site that was designed so that everyone in New Zealand could search for stuff, we have 4 temp.dbs on 2 dedicated spindles, and that seems to work okay. So if your target is New Zealand, that seemed to work okay. The search database. I'll show you in Procom on the next piece. When you search, we write stats back to the database. So we're writing to the log files and writing to the database. If you put the search database on read-optimized disks, it's like a RAID 5 set with a 2575 write-read cache, it's not going to perform that well. So understand what these databases need, and then we'll have a look at a tool to look at what's going on, and then make sure you have the right disk. It's fairly easy to reuse disk appropriately. The content databases themselves, typically all I want to do as a SharePoint administrator is to recover the database. It's very hard with the right database design and sizing to not have a content database perform. It would be a fairly special effort. And the way I approach that is to go with more is better. So we have a support boundary which is a 100 gigabyte content database. The number's made up. It just seems right based on our assumptions of what a standard organization would do with a collection of site collections containing standard documentation and standard people using it. There is no hard and fast reason that the 100 gig number is there. But what it does do is it'll actually point out a couple of tables which we'll have a look at soon. The 100 gigabytes is too big, in my opinion. My personal preference is have lots of smaller content databases. If you have lots of SQL servers, put them on lots of SQL servers to scale them out. I aim at 10 gigabytes of live content in my content databases. I then crank up the recycle bin, which we'll cover later, and versioning with some caveats to allow the database to grow into the 20 to 30 gig range. 100 gigabyte database is not what you want to do. Even though we say it's a support boundary, it's just because we test it. And practical guidance, go smaller. Now the only gotcha here, 2 gotchas. One is if you're going to use database mirroring, because of the way we use threads, 75 databases mirrored is about the practical limit for that. So that can have some impact on that. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if you have massive numbers of content databases, and one of our customers has 1,500 content DBs going onto a SQL cluster, it'll take a long time to fail over. So if you are looking at massive numbers of content DBs, you really are looking at massive numbers of SQL instances to make it as performant as possible. And key tables. Now, if you don't take away anything else from this, there are a couple of tables. Quick, don't, before you leave. Oh well, see you soon. There are 4 key tables we're going to go through. All doc streams, and all doc versions are the 3 we'll cover first, and then webs after that. So we'll show you what they mean. Which I can do here. All right, into SQL we go. So if I was to look at my SQL server, which I have here, as big as it'll get, there's a couple of database things we're going to look at. The first one, if we go back to looking at the standard way a database is built, if I look at the content database, can't do that. Go into properties. I don't know, what's this one do? No. There's a couple of settings here we're going to look at. The first one and the easy one is if we look at the options, it's in full recovery. So this is going to keep a lot of transactional logs, but allow me to roll back that way. The other option is simple, bulk log, we don't see a lot of in there. The second thing is the files, and this is where we look at the growth and auto growth. So if I look at that column there, this database is going to grow in 1 meg blocks for as big as I can go. So typically what you'd want to do there is either one or 2 things. The first one is change to a much larger auto growth number. Depending on how fast you can grow in SQL, because if I make this 100 meg, when I go to that threshold and I need to grow, it's going to take 100 meg growth. SQL platform has to deliver that within the time for the timeout for the application, is one way to go. So I typically say consider 100 meg and then crank it up or down as your platform can or can't deliver the growth. The second one, and one of the sites in Auckland does this, is to turn off auto growth and just use a SQL maintenance, a SQL operational process where they actually grow the database manually out of hours. So my recommendation is that if you have this database, 1 meg, you're going to have a fairly substandard performance environment for content. You probably get away with it, but it can be quite annoying, especially on large file uploads. We've tried to replicate this in the lab to show it's bad. It's quite hard to do, but over time it can become quite an issue. Now, if you're pre-SP2, this won't defragment either. Post-SP2, we can defragment this database. So basic database guidance is make sure you look at your growth, auto growth for that. In particular, we can also have a look at the system database here, TempDB. A couple of things we're going to have a look at here. The first one is that in my file group, I have 2 files. 1 and 2. So I will now allow 2 CPUs to execute through the TempDB process, removing one of the bottlenecks, which is quite good. The second thing is that, in my case, I'll put them on my data drive. Out of the box, if you don't tune where the database is going to reside, it's on your C drive. So you imagine you've spent all this money on this lovely SQL server, you haven't really configured it properly, put all your content databases on this massive SAN, your TempDB sitting on your C drive, performance becomes reasonably constrained. So always look at the TempDB process for that. Cool. Now, dive into the database. So I have a content database here. Support boundaries. Almost forgot. About 2 years ago, we had a support boundary, which is, this would basically be a non-supportable environment because you've looked at SQL, which is reasonably stupid. So you're all non-supported. Yay. About 2 years ago, we changed that to say, thou shalt not change, which I kind of agree with. The thou shalt not look was just stupid. So this is a content database in the SQL layer. So within this, we have 3 tables that we really care about. All docs. So everything you see in SharePoint, in this case the content database, exists in the all docs table. So navigation, there is a document link, everything is in here. And if we have a look at the, for some reason this resolution is going to drive me nuts. The properties for that in storage, under 2 meg. So not a lot of data used for that. Fairly small links in there. Second table. If you have any streaming content, it's stored in the all doc streams. In this site, I have a couple of PDFs. I have 48.2 meg of streaming content, so documents, etc., etc. Now, the important thing to realize is this relationship of 48 meg. Because if I look at the entire space used by the database, it'll be more than that. And where we start to see issues, and this is probably where we're going to see the most fun for a little while, is this all docs versions. If the AV guy can hear me, we need some power for your presentation laptop. So if it's lying around somewhere, you have 17 minutes. Well, we have 17 minutes. Is the all docs table. All doc versions table. When you create a version of a document, and I'll have a look at the table itself. Make sure I've got the right query. Yep, that's the one. Don't execute. It's going to create a version of the document. So how versions are created. So if I switch across to my SharePoint server, is it HP? Just grab this one. Sorry, I should have volunteered. I should be able to run if that's not live. Yeah, cool. So if I look at my SharePoint server, I have to do it from the client. I have a SharePoint site here. I have a document center. So I've actually got implicit versioning because I chose this template type and it's got a document center here. These documents are versioned. Now there's something really nice about that. If I go into this library and have a look at my settings here and then go into my versioning settings, and scroll down. I'm going to keep major and minors, and I'm going to keep the following number of versions to retain. It's blank for both of these, which means that I will keep these until I run out of numbers. So if you can imagine that you've gone and created a site using this template, you may not have understood that there's versions enabled, but don't worry, we'll keep every single version you can ever create on that. And so the way this can be seen is if I'll have to jump between machines a little bit. If I ran that query there, it returned 9 rows. The one we really want to look at is around here. So versions, minor versions, major version, and the size, almost 2 meg. So if I go back to my client and go into there, and a fairly common user process, check out a document, it's a 2 meg document, change one character, check it back again. I'll take a minor version on that, and if I'm lucky, execute. We still only have 9 rows. Why do we only have 9 rows? Sorry? That should just be a checkout check-in. Now, unfortunately, I continued the labs from this morning, so I should really have reset them. But try that. Check it out. And we'll check in another minor. Cool. See how lucky we get. 10 rows. Yay! The way it monkeys around with the major minors is quite interesting. Now, of importance to us is this one right here, 1025. So this is majors accounted by 512. So major 1, major 2, quite small, that's cool. And then 2.1 was actually 2.2 because we actually subtract 1. Some funky maths. But the important thing is that when I checked it back in, the database has grown 2 meg. So every time I change one of these documents and I increment the version, I'm going to start bloating the versions table out. So through either explicit or implicit versioning, this becomes a risk. And what you need to do, in my opinion, is to have a look at the size of the all-doc streams, 48 meg, and the all-doc versions is where you want to watch. Now, if I expect that in my environment I will keep 3 versions of every document, I would expect this to be a 3-to-1 ratio. It's currently only 11 meg. But you can imagine over time, this will explode. Current support case, no one's here from the company, cool. They have 68 megabytes of all docs. They have 438 megabytes of streams. They have 199 gigabytes of versions. Not good maths. Now, the way that this becomes worse, not from the fact that it's quite a large database, is that with a large database, it takes a lot longer to do things, like upgrade, content deploy, operate. So my advice is for the next year at least, keep an eye on this relationship between the all-docs stream and the all-docs version. If you're currently out of whack, there are a couple of things you can do. The first one is there's a tool on Codeplex that will allow you to mass set versions. You can manually set them. If you have a Premier support contract, you can give us a yell. We have a slightly more flexible tool to do that. But this, to me, is trouble brewing. I've had 4 or 5 major sites in the last 6 months hit this. Cool. What else do I have to show you on here? That one. Orphans. I will do that next. Cool. So, key takeaway from that is get to know the tables in SQL, get to know where the database is going to reside. That's what I didn't show you. Cool. All right. So, another little tool should be running Procmon. So, sysinternals tool. It's going to look at stuff hitting the box in technical terms. And what I've done here is basically put a filter in, says that only include everything that begins with the letter E, which is where my SQL databases are stored. And if I go OK, and I look along the top here, I've also filtered out everything except for the file system. So all I'm doing here is looking at interactions to the database files in eDrive. And so if I go back to my client and search for content, push enter, I get response. If I go back to my SQL server what I'm seeing there, further down, further down, will be with all the log volume for config, is I'll start to see log information for the actual search database itself. And as you do more and more searches, and if I had actually fixed my config log bloke, that'll become much more obvious that what database logs and database files are getting hit. So when you look at the disks available to you in SQL and think, okay, where do I have to put what sorts of disk? Procmon will show you where your live load is. So if you fire up a load tool and run it against the database, you'll see tempdb getting hit. You'll see the search database is getting hit. So when anyone ever asks, how do I know which databases need to get the priority for disk, Procmon will show you that happening there. Hopefully a lot clearer than that one is. What's going on here? I think I changed the time, so the timer service is going a bit nuts. All right. 11:27. Cool. Okay, so database done very quickly. Next one's the SharePoint application. And I'll give you a little bit of guidance on this one, but not too much in depth. The important thing is when you create a web application, it is going to be a process that can execute a .NET application, a very large .NET application. So what you want to do is to try and minimize the number of web applications you have, and in particular the number that can get hot per server. So when you look at a typical architecture, it may have two web front ends and the load balance, and an application server running central admin, search, Excel. If you use the DNS load balancer or DNS aliasing or whatever method, you can redirect live user load only to the front end service, which means that only their web applications will get hot because they get hit. And then you can push all the system processes to the back end. It's a fairly straightforward process to do that. It's called isolation. That's fine. What's not fine is that where you try and restrict which config gets pushed out to which server. Try not to do that. So understand where you can put the footprint for servers, for memory. Now, the major interesting thing to me is that with each web application, you get this impact on disk footprint, and that brings complexity. And this is normally overlooked. When I create a web application, it will create a virtual directory in IIS that will have a web config file. It's not uncommon for us to have issues where something has not been done or something has been done to web config. So an example is that we have a customer that has a web application that's extended, therefore we get two IIS sites. One's for port 80, one for 443. They then deployed faceted search, which writes the web config file, but it only ever worked on port 80, never 443. The reason for that is the changes to web config were never done on the second one. So the guidance for having more web applications either created or extended is it does increase the complexity. There's more web config files, and I'll show you soon, that you need to look at. Now, how you can turn that into a perfect storm is when you realize that the change is in 80 and not 443, and you copy the web config across. Never, ever copy a web config, because there's a machine key in there, which is unique. Or you can configure it to dynamically create, which is nice. So if you wanted to make that really bad, and this customer thought, why not, dragged and dropped the config file across. The faceted search worked, and all the cryptography stuff started failing. So please don't copy the web config. Second issue for that is that if you make a change to web config, it's an outage. Please do it after hours if you can. It's a very small outage, but it is one nevertheless. So try and minimize that. We won't do web app. Okay, shared service provider. This is my fault, this one. So for the last 2 years, ignoring the last 4 months, 2 years prior to that, I trained that if you wanted to decide where your site collections were created, and I'll show you in a second, you could put a database to offline. That just stops site collection creation. What I didn't know at the time, and Microsoft didn't know until August 2009, was that breaks user sync. So if you have followed my guidance, I apologize, but I'll show you how to fix that. Or if you've done the prepare to move switch, you may find that this breaks in the shared service provider. User information, how it gets into SharePoint, 2 phases. First one, user profile import from AD or somewhere else into the shared service provider, and then when a user accesses a content database under that web app, we then do this user profile sync to the content database. That's the bit that offline breaks. And I'll show you how to fix that now. So the bit I'm talking about now is in SharePoint, or the bits we talked about. So if I go into SharePoint, cool. If I look at a central application, if I look at my content databases here, I can see that I have 2 content databases on under this web application. And I have one of them set to stopped on the top. Now that's going to do a couple of things. If you want to toggle that, it's fairly easy. Just go into here, ready, it'll go away, blah, blah. If I could get this resolution right. Cool. It's now back up and running. Now why you would consider changing this status is for one key reason. If you look at the maximum number of sites and the current number of sites, when I go to create a site collection in a web application, I can't choose a content database. What happens is that the SharePoint application will say, here are the 2 content databases I have, or N. 15,000 minus 1, content 1, 14,999, 90 minus 0, 90. I will put the next 14,900 and however many, my maths isn't that good, into content 1, which means that you have a huge overload into one of the content databases. The way you can stop that is by switching this database to offline, and site collection creation will ignore content 1. I can add and remove sites, I can add and remove content. The only thing I cannot do is create a site collection. So this was really good guidance from me in particular. Unfortunately, unless you're on the August 2009 cumulative update or later, this will stop user profile sync. So upgrade. Cool. That one. IIS, well, we're talking about it. So if I go into IIS here, which is 7, there's a couple of things we want to look at here. The first one is if I look at the basic settings for a web, advanced settings, I'm going to see a couple of things because I'm in the wrong place. If I go into the site and look at the basic settings, that's why. Physical path, C, blah, 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 80. This is where the web config file will reside. So when I'm making manual changes, and the guidance is you should be doing solution deployment, but unfortunately, Wayne, in the real world, that's not quite so easy. Your web config file's there. So I would be making changes to this. Now, as field engineers, we are trained that no matter what you assume, you always check the site in IIS before you go and edit this puppy. There have been cases where they've edited the wrong ones. All right. The other thing we want to look at is in the application pools, and this goes back to the first couple of slides. If I go into advanced settings for this one, here, I have the identity. So this is the account that this application pool and anything attached to it will contact SQL using. So if I thought SPS Farm is not the one I want and change it in here, fairly quickly bad stuff will happen. So the application won't open, and that's not good. So the only way you can change that, if you want to do so, is to go into SharePoint itself, which is over here, and go back into service accounts, ops. Yep, and change. Come on, clicker. That here. What will happen then is a timer job will fire and push that out. The only one you can't change from here is the farm web application. You have to do that through SES ADM because chicken and egg. It'll time out. Cool. I think that's all on that one. There's one other thing I've forgotten. Now, this actually covers back to the SQL part. Orphans, database and site orphans are a reasonably common issue now. We changed or highlighted our backup restore guidance to say that if you wanted to upgrade SharePoint in a very large content farm, detach your content databases, do the upgrade, reattach them, it'll reattach them and upgrade them in the process. In 2010, you can now parallelize that. That's probably the wrong word. So what that did is actually expose us to orphans. So when we look at a site versus site collection, which I'll show you later, there's a very important difference between a site collection is that it has a GUID, and that GUID is unique in the farm. What that means is that we can't present the same site collection GUID twice. So companies following our guidance detached all their content databases, reattached the content databases. Unfortunately, they had pre-existing sites that they hadn't completed, and they became live. The truly unfortunate thing was that those sites were created 2 years prior to the upgrade and had 2 years worth of content that the customer thought just got flushed. Reasonably easy fix, fairly dramatic political outcome, unfortunately. Now, the way you can have a look to see, am I currently at risk of site orphans, is in our friends SQL. So the fourth table that I care about recently here is the webs table. And I have a very simple query here. Actually, I have the right query here, which is going to go through and return a subset of data. Now, the bit I really care about is the template version 0. In this site, I have site 1 and site 2 with template version 0, which means that if I was to hit them, site 1, I get the template selection, which means this is a truly blank site. There is nothing in there. So it is actually feasible that I could create another site with the same name programmatically. It is possible to bypass some of the checking in here, which is what the customer managed to do 55 times. The way you're going to look for this is to run that script. So if I was to emulate what they did on the SharePoint server, they basically ran this command here, which is going to create a new site called site 3, 55 times. And then if we go back to SQL to have a look, in the query we returned 9 rows. If we execute that again, I now have 10 rows, and I have site 3 template version 0. So the nice thing about this is because it's in SQL, it will show you this even though it's not going to present the site collection. So if I had lots of site 3s throughout my content databases in my farm, only the one that was presented to the web application first will be rendered. The others will sit there orphaned as such. So I recommend that you run checks on the template version in the webs table as a not regular but operational process to highlight any zeros. If you find a 0, find out whether it's got to go away or not. If it's got to go away, do it through the app object model. Please don't just delete it from SQL. If you're going to delete from SQL, call us first, and we'll push the red button. That way we can fire someone, which is quite enjoyable. All right. IIS, we won't go through too much in here. Now, there's a couple of things, and I showed you the context account. It never sounds right coming from me. TCP port host header. If you're using alternate access mappings, this is where it comes in. So I have an AAM, which is farm 1. In IIS, it'll have a host header on port 80, for instance. So be careful when you're changing the port and the host header, because that's what SharePoint will respond, what IIS will respond, and then pass to the SharePoint application to decide whether it's going to do something with it. But always be careful of manual changes. Manual changes in IIS typically cause grief. In that. A couple of tuning points, aware of bear time and the like. Web gardens are bad in SharePoint. Let's think about that, they're bad. And kernel mode authentication in IIS 7 on Server 2008 and R2 is proving in the field to be reasonably problematic. So if you are going to look at it, look very carefully. We have one customer turning it off 3 weeks ago. It looks really good in TechNet, by the way. It looks even better on a whiteboard. Unfortunately, when you turn electricity into it, it didn't look so good. Okay, suck eggs, big egg. Please forgive me. Site collection versus site. Why am I telling you what's different in these in level 300? Site collection, admin functional boundary. You can back up and restore a site collection. It has a single GUID in the farm, and hence the orphans issue is just waiting to get you. So when you are looking at site collections, be aware that you can't import or export them. We can't reset the GUID. But also be aware that this orphans thing's just sitting there. The sites. I have a lot of fun recently with sites. Sites are just a functional boundary. That's fine. You import and export a site. We use it for content deployment. How does that work? Because you can export it back into the farm as we reset the GUID. Costs of resetting the GUID, workflows break, email alerts break, and you have to re-enable features. So if you are looking at site export as a backup restore method, which is still quite valid, be aware that you're going to lose workflow alerts and you're going to have to re-enable the features. The reason this has become quite popular recently is that when we look at recoverability of content, I'm a huge fan of just taking a SQL Server backup of your content database, reattaching it to another farm with the same schema number, and then pulling out what you want. Either directly dragging out the content or exporting out the site to import it back in. But be very aware that we do reset the GUID on that. If you are going to use a standby farm for recovery, it has to be at the same schematic number. It should be feature comparable. Depending on what you're pulling out, that's not always a hard requirement on that. Cool. Now, the one that always makes that storm a little bit shittier is Windows Server. As a customer, version table blowout, they thought, how do we fix this? How about we take a clean deployment of the content? That's cool. We'll do that. Where do we put it? We'll just build another farm. That's cool. We have no documentation. That's okay. Oh, we don't have a backup of any of this. We forgot. So where it becomes quite difficult to fix is where people forget about this component. Now, this is a key part of the backup restore process. Make sure you get the 12 Hive. So C program files, common files, Microsoft shared, something 12. Thank you. Web server extension 12. This is my last ever technical presentation after 11 years, so I descend into management very soon. The iNet pub is going to get the configuration IIS, very important you get that, and the GAC, so any assemblies, blah, blah, blah. Now, the one bit that's missing from that slide is if you use alternate access mappings, you have to run STS-ADM-enum alternate domains to a text file. But please make sure that you have a good backup of one of the SharePoint web servers, preferably the app server, before and after each major change. If you can't restore this, so customer embarked on an SP2 upgrade, it didn't work. They didn't have a good backup of the server. Gets fun. It's not actually that hard to fix. As long as you have documentation, they didn't. As long as you have the source code, they didn't have that either. So it is quite painful. If you have the docs, I can build your farm in 30 minutes. If you have the solutions, I could probably get it up in about an hour, hour and a half. Now, one of the other things that I forgot from the slide is that this concept of the source library. When you install SharePoint, the application, the binary installation, it will set a schema number of something. Now, when you install another server to join the farm, that server has to be at or less than the version of the farm. So if you've got an SP2 farm, you could build an RTM or SP1 SharePoint server and then upgrade it to join the farm. You still have to install the MSPs and the like. If you try and join a server that's at a higher schema number to the farm, it'll be hard blocked. So you can't join an SP2 server to an SP1 farm. So treat the install source with some reverence for that. All right. Demo. I've demoed most of that. Cool. Search. Search is fun. All right. Simple process. So we have an application server. This is going to do the crawl. You'll see crawl and index defined using the same process in our documents. It gets quite confusing. I have a web server, in this case, which is holding query, so the bits the people hit. You could have query and index on the application server, which is the case I have, and I'll show you the impact of that. And a database server. It's always good to have databases. On the left-hand side, I have a couple of content sources, two of them, file server and web server. When you define a content source in SharePoint, there's a couple of things that you're going to do as part of that definition. The first one is you're going to have a target. Okay, so it's a file share on /server/share. By stipulating that content type of file server, I've said this is where you go to get the content, but I've also said use SMB to get there. So I've implicitly told it what protocol handler to load. So when we look at crawl, protocol handler is the first part we need to look at. So my content source for file server, I'm going to use SMB to go to server 1/share to get that content. The web server, if it's a SharePoint server or not the SharePoint server, it's going to use HTTP, gets, and pulls the bits back. So the content source explicitly defines the path and implicitly defines the protocol handler. Now the process, and this is where it gets quite interesting because I'm not sure how public some of this is. Crawl starts, which is why it exploded. It'll go to the content source, and for every single file with a file extension in your crawl definition, it will copy it back to the crawler. So if you imagine that top file server there is the NAS, it has 2 terabytes of files on it, Word documents, PDFs, that's cool. It will copy every single one of them across the network to the crawler. On the crawler, as a temporary process, it'll crack them open using the iFilter, issue 2. It'll then pull the metadata out, author, side, blah, 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 throw it into the metadata database, goes on the SQL server eventually, and then takes a head of the document, puts that into its index files to go off to a query server. Now the interesting thing to me is that that's a lot of data coming back across the wire. What happens if it's a WAN? Well, that's cool. What happens if this NAS was bought 8 years ago? It's just hanging in there. Why don't we hit it with 32 threads? And that becomes quite interesting. I'll show you how to tune that down. The iFilter. Now, depending on the quality of the iFilter you have installed on the crawler, will impact how quickly and how accurately you open these files up. Not all iFilters for all document formats are the same. So please test if you're doing large amounts of a portable document format I can't name. Cool. So once it's all cracked open, the metadata goes down to the database server into the search database, and the index files, well, it's actually an army of files, go off to the query server. If it's all in one box, it automatically propagates and stays, which I'll show you. Now the gotcha. When we finish the crawl and we propagate the index file and we stamp the search database, they're all record aligned. So first document you found goes into record 1 in the search database and into the index. 2, 2, 3, blah, blah, blah. If you come to restore, these need to be aligned exactly. So if you can't guarantee that if you were to restore your SQL server, that the index files for search are identically aligned, they're worthless. So they're worse than worthless, actually, because if someone searches, they may actually get the metadata for one file with a snippet from the other one, which is hilarious. So my guidance is that calculate how long it takes you to do a full crawl. If it's less than 4 hours, and it typically takes an IT person 4 hours to figure out something's dramatically wrong, don't back up and restore. Figure out how long it's going to take you to recrawl. 4 hours. If I had a 4-hour outage on search, I'd be more than happy on a system outage. Yeah. Your mileage may vary dramatically. In Microsoft, it was taking us 14 days to crawl some of our properties, so not such a good option for us. Okay. Now the propagation becomes interesting. So if I switch across, unfortunately I only have a single server SharePoint farm, so I can't show you too much, but if I go into search here, search administration, a couple of things we're going to see on that page. Sorry, just going to, there we go, that was annoying. Okay, so 950 items in the index, that's cool. Propagation not required. Now the reason for that is because query and index are on the same server. Now if I had multiple SharePoint servers and I wanted to put query on another one, I have to take query off this one. You cannot have query and index on the same server and expect it to propagate to another server. It will just not do it. Automatically finishes propagation. A couple of cases we've seen is where they've had index, query, good design on 2 servers. Be careful which fingers you hold up. Someone decided they needed highly available query, so we add query here. And what happens is that this query index file updates, this one stays stale for 6 months. Don't do that. If you need to have highly available query, you need to have 3 servers. Yeah, you have to have 3 servers. Cool. Other interesting thing is that I currently have 20 gigabytes of free space on my server. The reason I'm interested in this number in particular is because that when I crawl a content source, and there's a good book, MS Press book, inside the search and query engine, it's about the only one we were actually honest about this, is that, getting close to beer, is that when you crawl, rule of thumb is that 12% of the target content will go into the index. You have 1 terabyte of content, expect to get around 120 gigabytes in your index file, plus 1 extra lot. So we have now in next. So we're now at 240 gigabytes. And because we're Microsoft, we round up 30%. So you'll see the 30% number used. Now, depending on the content you're crawling, that will be around about there or not. My extensive testing is it's less than that, but I would say that you would calculate a minimum 15% of your target. So if you imagine you brought all these servers, you're going to make them nice little blades. They sit there, they've got 70 gig of data on their disks, blah, blah, blah. And then you go and crawl 2 terabytes of data. The index file becomes an issue. Best way around that is to have dedicated query servers and only 1 or 2 of them. We designed a farm which had 50 terabytes of data. They had to go for 1 single query box just for the disk cost. All right, skip along. Cool. So, recap. Index crawl, content source, start address, a schedule, the content access account. I didn't show you. I need to show you that. Cool. When you read our white papers and we talk about this one content access account across the enterprise, because everyone in the organization will agree that, yep, we'll make this content 1 and we'll make the password and we'll never, ever, ever change it and we'll give it read access to everything, or smoking crack. So the way you do change that is we go into the content source, and if I was to create a new content source, I don't want to do it from there, how we get around that is to look at our crawl rules. So I'll cheat on the lab. You would normally have a content source, but I'm quite lazy. If I wanted to define a separate account for each target, I'd make this an include rule and specify a different content access account, which would mean that for your file server guys, you would have 1 account. For your Exchange public folders, you'd have another account. For your public-facing HTTP website, you'd have another account. The unfortunate thing for how this is designed is it's very hard to realize you need to click on include to get this up, and you won't find it in much of our docs. So if you can't get the 1 account to rule them all for crawling, it's fairly simple to change there by content source. As I said before, you don't want to really beat the crap out of your content targets, so you can change crawler impact rules here, add a rule, and then you can dial up. I don't think you can do it. Oh, cool. Dial up or down the simultaneous requests. So for instance, if you had a NAS box on its last legs, you might dial that down to 1 or 2. If it was really, really, really suffering, the last option down there, which is 1 document at a time with a gap. Now, as you dial this down, it's going to take longer to fill the index, but the box will stay up. If you really don't like someone, you can crank it up to 64. Unfortunately, this will blow out your iFilter as well, so be careful. It's a bit of karma on that. Search service. Cool. Okay. Did I miss anything there? Protocol handler versus iFilter. Protocol handlers don't worry too much about unless you go custom. iFilters, large sites, please choose wisely. Database index files, make sure that you realize they're record aligned. If you can't guarantee restoration to the same record alignment, consider a full crawl on that. The query process, index file size is the big one, and propagation. And typically this will become an issue in my world when you change the design after. So for instance, it was quite common, index query, highly available query, boom, added it to box, stale index, as we will probably see that. Reports. And if you have nothing else to do on the weekend, have a look at the query reports. They're actually quite useful for how people are using the platform. 0 results, best bets, and the like. Jump me along. Backup restore. Okay. There are a few more slides in the slide deck, but we'll finish on the next one. There's only a couple more interesting ones after this. Content recovery. Now this goes hand in hand with the content database size guidance. We'll finish here actually. If you have a smaller live content size in your content database, that allows you to do something that I find quite interesting. So if I was to say I'm going to only allow 10 gigabytes of live content in each of my content databases, but I'm going to crank out the recycle bin to a year, I know that I'm going to cycle through double my content in a year. So people are going to delete crap. So I'm going to end up with a 30 gigabyte content database. I'm happy with that. Now what that means is that for 1 year, maybe plus 1 day, if someone deletes anything smaller than a site, they can restore it themselves. So they don't have to talk to IT. They don't have to say, I've just deleted my document. You go, yeah, go to your recycle bin. It's there. And pull it out. So by having smaller content in your content databases, the recycle bin becomes incredibly interesting to me. Having a large recycle bin on 100 gigabytes of live content in a content database becomes reasonably exciting for me. And sleep becomes an option. Versioning, watch this one. So understand the relationship between the number of versions you expect to see and the size relative to the all-doc stream table of the all-doc version table. If you currently have a SharePoint site now, you may have implicit versioning. Just go and have a little check and do a little bit of maths. It's Friday. That's not Friday, is it? Wednesday, my goodness, on that. And the other nice thing that we're starting to see a little bit more on is that don't be afraid to use the content database restoration for content recovery. So in all of our guidance, you'll see restoring the content database for system recovery, building, boom, oops. If someone's deleted a document and you need that document back and you can't get it any other way, if you were to restore that content database to another farm at the same schema number, you can pull it out. We have people who are considering making that a formal part of their backup restore. We won't do anything else. We'll just back up the SQL content database, and if you lose it, we'll just reattach it and pull it out. So those three things there may be quite useful for content recovery. Now, there are more slides that will be available, but we just go into a little bit more detail, and we are out of time. So do you have any questions? Please fire away. I can't see a thing. 3 days of written a bin. Oh. Yes. The one thing I haven't done is my email address is TROYK, so troyk @microsoft.com. I've already been emailing it out today, so if you give me an email, I'll send it to you. It's about 775K compressed, so it's not a biggie. So email me, I'll respond. Otherwise, it'll be part of the downloads. But far away, yes. There's not much more stuff, but yeah, thank you. Anyone else? I'm standing between you and the bar, so I'm not suicidal. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed TechEd. Enjoy.